So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. I'm Shelley Hazer. I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning, and I just would really like to welcome the community, those of you from the Historical Society, from Lifelong Learning. I think it's going to be a great evening, and I can't wait to hear from our speaker, Dr. Vigliotti. And I'm just going to turn it over to Nicole Diem, and she's going to introduce our speaker this evening.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicole Dean, the librarian and curator for the Historical Society. And I would just like to say from our director, Megan Alta, she's very sorry that she couldn't make it tonight, but unfortunately she took ill and she didn't want to spread anything around just in case. But we're here. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeanette Vigliotti. She's an assistant professor of classical and liberal education and faculty coordinator of core general education at Flagler College. She received her interdisciplinary humanities PhD in media art text from Virginia Commonwealth University, and she's also a Flagler College alum. Some of the classes she teaches include first-year seminar, St. Augustine and World History, Digital Humanities, Speculative Fiction and the Contemporary World, and Real History, Science on the Screen. Her courses often utilize the unique aspects of St. Augustine. As an interdisciplinary scholar, she focuses on feminist science and technology studies, digital studies, literary studies, poetry, and public history. Her poetry has appeared in Pacific Review, a West Coast annual. Her scholarly work on digital identities has been published by the international journal Comunicazioni Sociali, Journal of Media, Performing Arts, and Cultural Studies. And she co-authored Collaboration in Community, the Resilience Project in St. Augustine, and Archival Outlook with the Society of American Archivists. For 12 years, she has worked with the St. Augustine Historical Society in a variety of capacities. Most recently, she is the editor-in-chief of the El Scribano, the St. Augustine Journal of History. Please welcome Dr. Jeanette Vigliotti.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Okay, so can everyone hear me in the back? I want to make sure. No? Yes. Okay, yes. We're starting off great. All right. So a few days ago, we participated in a democratic tradition, the ability to vote, to seek representation, to express our choice, our agency, and it's here I want to acknowledge the road to suffrage for many portions of the population was long, nuanced, and deeply complicated. 124 years ago, women, particularly white women, gained the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. 124 years, by the way, translates into 27 of our 60 presidential elections. In preparing for this talk, and considering its proximity to our most recent election, I reflected a lot on Flagler College's core values. It seems especially important given the location of this presentation, given that our student demographic is largely women, given that the college's origins was a women's college, and also given the fact that I am a graduate of this institution, that I find resonance with the long road to women's enfranchisement with the core values of this college. Flagler College's thoughtful consideration of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to have respectful and inclusive community, and what it means to steward our stories seems like a necessary place to start. So in fact, when we start to peel back the layers of women's suffrage in St. Augustine, we can see a movement that is alive with debates and conversations about what it actually means to be in community, what it means to be at stake to each other, and also conversations of who gets included and who does not get included. These serious questions of belonging, of agency, and the ways in which we are responsible to each other are punctuated by gendered expectations and racial politics of the early 1900s in America's progressive era. As both a literary scholar and a public historian, I'm often concerned with the idea of representation. Representation is a means by which we create meaning, and that meaning becomes culturally lodged and significant. Representation both shapes broader social understandings, broader social practices, broader social expectations, and is shaped by who has access to story creation and power. And so, in thinking about the women's suffrage movement in St. Augustine, we are required to move between national conversations, regional differences, and local manifestations. In this way, the talk tonight traces the nimble networks of women who, though geographically disparate, were participating in a nationwide conversation about the enfranchisement of women. I have selected just a few moments for us to explore together, with the acknowledgement and disclaimer that there are other stories and narratives to tell around this topic. First, I will describe the broader landscape of American women's suffrage from the mid to late 1800s. Second, I will explore women's suffrage within the state of Florida between 1880 and 1897. Third, I will outline the rise of the Southern Women's Suffrage Organization in the 19-teens and the reawakening of suffrage conversations in St. Augustine, Florida in those same years. I will detail 1914, when the suffrage movement in St. Augustine takes roots and sprouts. And finally, I will explore the 19 to 1920 years, which includes not only the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but also the suffragists' continued organizing as the 1920 presidential election approached. Historian David Nolan notes that a St. Augustine minister and his wife attended the National Women's Suffrage Convention in 1869. Our St. Augustinians bore witness to one of the first significant fractures in the American women's suffrage movement, and the manifestation ultimately of two different organizations. The first organization was the American Women's Suffrage Association, or the AWSA, which was under the leadership of Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, among others, while the National Women's Suffrage Organization, or the NWSA, continued to be led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This split begins to formulate a major driving debate, among other things, the question of pursuing a federal amendment which would enfranchise women with the stroke of a pen, or the question of pursuing state suffrage amendments which would empower individual states to determine enfranchisement. For the South in particular, the question of state amendments intensifies in the 20th century. Previous conversations about universal suffrage for both Black Americans and women fall to the wayside in this period. Despite previous alignments with abolitionist circles, a variety of natural suffrage leaders reject the idea that formerly enslaved Black men should achieve the right to vote before educated white women. This national racialized division, much like the conversations about state amendments and federal amendments, animates discussions in Florida about women's suffrage. In the 1880s, as women's suffrage begins to awaken on Florida's Gulf Coast in Tampa, Florida, a new wave of suffragist leadership emerges in the Northeast. Those two rival organizations fold back into one another and become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Reinvigorated under new leadership, as well as the influx of travelers moving in and out of Florida, the first attempt to organize and advocate for women's right to vote begins in earnest with Ella Chamberlain, who, after attending a women's suffrage convention in Des Moines, Iowa, brings her ideas back to Florida. Ella secures a column in a local paper, and when the editors tell her, you really should just be writing about things that women like and maybe what children like, she bristles at this and she pushes back pretty hard. She says the world is not suffering for another cake recipe, and honestly, the children seem to be doing better than the women. At an 1880 dinner party, Ella discusses the injustice of taxation without representation, a concern that she has for women, and she is so impassioned at this dinner conversation and so inspiring that the men and women around her encourage her to create an organization. So Ella creates the Equal Suffrage Society, which is known as the Florida Women's Suffrage Association, which ultimately becomes affiliated with the North American Women's Suffrage Association, so when those two organizations came back together. Like other white women of the upper middle class, racial politics are going to shape Ella's vision of suffrage. Ella Chamberlain publishes in January 1895 in an issue of Women's Journal, which was a national publication originally associated with the American women's suffrage movement, a number of thoughts about the particular problems that women in the South are facing that are different than their northern counterparts. In this issue of the Women's Journal, she writes, "I'm a freeborn American woman, and I deny that my brother American can properly represent me. How can I, with the blood of heroes in my heart and the free, independent spirit they bequeath me, quietly sit to representation by the alien and the Negro?" These 1895 comments reflect a larger regional interpretation of women's suffrage. Unlike the abolitionist conversations which inflected women's suffrage circles prior to the 1869 split, Southern white women suffragists were less likely to be concerned with the enfranchisement of Black women. And one of the motivations for the states' rights approach in the South was the disenfranchising tactics such as the grandfather's clause, the literacy test, and the poll taxes that were already placed as barriers to the enfranchisement of Black men. And that would also be applied to women, Black women. I think another thing that's important to note about Ella Chamberlain and her humiliation that formerly enslaved men had the right to vote and thus power over her parallels to rhetoric that we're actually going to see many decades later in St. Augustine. So again, while Ella Chamberlain is not a central figure in the St. Augustine story, her initial organizing efforts offer a narrative pattern we will encounter again and again. Her efforts at organization are also new statewide, and we know stories have power. Stories have material consequences. And once a story is introduced into the world, it cannot be called back. In 1895, the Florida Women's Suffrage Association has about 100 members. That same year, membership increases to women throughout the state of Florida, and ideas about women's enfranchisement begin to circulate throughout the state, starting to inspire other women to take on more public roles and to be involved in this work. Unfortunately, though, the Florida Women's Association evaporates in 1897 when Ella Chamberlain leaves the state, and women's suffrage in Florida remains dormant until June of 1912. The dormancy parallels what other historians call the doldrums, a period of sluggishness nationally from 1896 to 1910. There's rising concerns during this period about immigration. There's philosophies of social Darwinism, shifting race relations, rising conservatism in the Gilded Age, and a deep concern about the nature and integrity of the family structure. So the women suffragists in this period are suddenly met with a very different temperature. Rather than arguing broadly about women's role in society and offering more thorough critiques, the conversation nationally narrows to the issue of women's suffrage alone. Over the next 2 years, from 1912 to 1914, there are additional moments of fracture in the national suffrage movement. Again, the landscape is shifting. There's discontent with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Happening concurrently is a split with Alice Paul, a militant suffrage who worked with Pankhurst across the pond. And also there was the Progressive Party's platform for equal suffrage that is just coming onto the scene, and a growing dissent amongst white Southern suffragist leaders. The increased talk of a federal amendment carries the threat for Southern women, similar to the 15th, with the enfranchisement of Black men. A federal amendment ran the risk of ultimately jeopardizing white supremacy. An emerging Southern suffragist leader, Kate Gordon, organizes a conference in New Orleans on November 12th and 13th, 1913, and one of the dominant conversations in this conference is the push away from the federal amendment. And she believed that conversations around the enfranchisement of Black women could be used to actually accelerate progress in Southern states towards women's enfranchisement. During these 2 days, Southern suffragist leaders agreed on a strategy to uphold a states' rights approach And they form another association, the Southern States Suffrage Conference, or the SSWC. We have so many acronyms in this talk. And it was born from these concerns and conversations. After a decade of dormancy, Florida's women's suffrage movement reawakened, shifting from Florida's Gulf Coast to Florida's First Coast. In 1912, just to the north of us, Roselle Cooley, Francis Anderson, and others formed the Florida Equal Franchise League. Just, like I said, just up the road, not in St. Augustine, though. Equal franchise was the preferred term, as women's suffrage and votes for women seemed to have an alienating effect, and these women wanted to be successful in their plight to gain more grounds for women. This framing of equal franchisement also parallels the move by the Southern States Suffrage Conference writ large. Over the next year, in 1913, Dr. Mary Sanford organizes the Florida Equal Suffrage Association, which becomes one of the principal organizations fighting for suffrage in Florida. And formal suffrage leagues are formed in the following cities: Jacksonville, Pensacola, Orlando, Lake Helen, Zellwood, Pine Castle, Winter Park, Milton, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Tarpon Springs, Miami, Davis, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, Coconut Grove, Stewart, Orange City, Tallahassee, Ruskin, Florence Villa, and Winter Haven. You'll notice that list does not include St. Augustine. So what does that mean for the city? How does the suffrage movement manifest here? In the absence of equal suffrage leagues, how do women actually mobilize? Where are the leaders locally? How do their motivations tie into larger regional trends? How do race and class implicate this movement? What images of suffragists did St. Augustinians encounter locally in the form of editorials, newspaper articles and speeches, and naturally in the form of syndicated political cartoons, and importantly, silent films, which are an emerging form of mass media and an industry that is tied to the 19-teens in St. Augustine? To answer these questions, we will be turning our attention to Valentine's Day, 1914. A headline from the St. Augustine Record: suffragists are conferring here. So I would just love to look at this article together. Planning a general campaign over the southern states, several noted suffrage leaders are conferring here with Mrs. J.O. Stevenson this afternoon. Mrs. Stevenson has been asked by Miss Medill McCormick, chairman of the Congressional Suffrage Committee, to take up active work in the field. Mrs. Dorothy Earl of Washington, Mrs. Edith Stone of Washington, Mrs. Laura Ingle of the same city, and Mrs. Essie Locke of Jacksonville State Treasurer are the visiting ladies. These 4 sentences mark the hard launch of women's suffrage in St. Augustine and show St. Augustine women's entanglement with the national movement. Mrs. McCormick, or Ruth, was an important national figure for women's suffrage, and in 1914, after Alice Paul breaks from the National American Women's Suffrage Association to form the Congressional Union and work towards a federal amendment, Ruth McCormick steps in to fill her position. The presence of the national leadership in St. Augustine, Florida, really does demonstrate the strength and mobility of women's networks. A few weeks later, on March 5th, 1914, the St. Augustine Record reports again on suffrage activity. This time, there is a presence of 2 dominant suffragist factions, the NWSA and the SSWSC. And rather than just meeting with Mrs. J.O. Stevenson, the visiting suffragists will be holding a rally that gather the public together. For this first suffrage rally, there are a number of women speakers: Ms. J.O. Stevenson, our local organizer, Ms. Kate Gordon, the woman president of the Southern States Suffrage Conference, Ms. Lois Sharp from Jacksonville, and 2 women from Washington, Mrs. Stoner and Mrs. Ingle. And according to the record, these women are invited to the Ponce de Leon Hotel to have a lunch. I had asked our archivist to see if we had any images or anything from this lunch, but unfortunately we do not, which is going to be a trend as we continue to talk. Kate Gordon, the newly elected president of the SSWC, enchants the crowd. As you might recall, Gordon is the one advocating for states' rights and state constitutional amendments. Hundreds of people gather in the plaza, even though this was a last-minute rally. The mayor at the time, Amos Corbett, briefly addresses the crowd before introducing Washington State Congressman J.W. Bryan. In 1910, women in his home state of Washington already received enfranchisement. So having him here helped legitimize the demand and the demand for women's enfranchisement. The record reports that Miss Kate Gordon gave the longest address. This detail, although small, seems to be an indication of the value of Miss Gordon's perspective. And what might have been most attractive to the gathered crowd, the record also explains that all of the suffragist lectures were thoroughly convincing and merited a lot of applause. In an article from the Tampa Tribune in April 1914, reflecting on the St. Augustine rally, a writer shares this: Miss Gordon is one of the most wonderful speakers I have ever heard. It was a marvel to me to observe how she held the crowd at St. Augustine, Florida. There on the plaza of the oldest settlement of the United States, she talked to a crowd that filled the place as far as her voice could reach. And they stayed there and listened to her until 6 o'clock, when the shades of the evening warned them of the lateness of the hour. The article goes on to say, I was much amused to observe the manner in which she handled the question of the Negro women in the South. Miss Gordon replied that intelligent white women should be able to employ the same means to protect herself from the colored women as Southern men have been used to protect themselves from colored men. Just as Ella Chamberlain had argued decades prior, Gordon twined the project of women's suffrage to shifting racial relations in postbellum society. We are going to return our attention to the racialized dynamics in plight for women's suffrage in a little bit, but I also want to take a side quest with you all and consider this last detail in the article, which indicates that at this very first suffrage rally, that a moving picture was taken on scene to be produced with others. So in a film called St. Augustine in Motion, I realize I'm behind a slide. I'm very sorry about that. In a film called St. Augustine in Motion, which was to be shown at the Jefferson Theater, which was located on the corner of Cordova and Cathedral. The Jefferson was one of the 3 movie theaters located in town, and I have been unsuccessful in my attempt to track down either a clip or still of the film. However, on March 6th, the record features an article entitled See Yourself as Others, and explains that manager Clark has gone to great expense getting men to come here from New York to take these pictures, and he expects cooperation from everyone in obtaining the best picture possible. The phrase obtaining the best picture possible demonstrates the new knowledge-making power of silent films, the ability, through mechanical capture of light against bodies, to certify presence and create testimony. This curated look at St. Augustine, provided by St. Augustine in Motion, promises to, quote, show all the prominent points of interest, including the churches, the schools, lodges, the mayor, his staff, board of trade, fire department in action, business places, and street scenes. Furthermore, the article explains they took moving pictures of the suffrage meeting, showing speakers, also the entire audience. If you were present, you can see yourself as others see you. 1, there is a very particular vision of St. Augustine being crafted that shows the city's industrial progress, the state of education, the efficiency of business. Images, moving and still, have the power of representation and replication. It matters what scenes were placed in this idea of progress, which is also captured by that title, St. Augustine in Motion. It matters that the suffragist leaderships were placed in this honor. It produces a particular image of what Southern suffragists should look like, reinforcing the complicated symbol of what historians and literary scholars alike term the new woman. In the progressive era, both the North and South, the image of the new woman does a lot of important cultural and political work. So what do I mean by work? In this context, work refers to the way a certain subsection of women was being represented to the public. This representation, found in entertainment and newspaper articles alike, starts to shape people's expectations, and those ideas end up animating action. This is one of the ways in which we can see the power of representation and the power of symbolic functioning as a socio-political mechanism. And this also really nicely parallels what historian Anne Fryer Scott argues in Southern Lady from Pedestal to Politics, 1830 to 1930, about the specific incarnation of new women in Southern spaces. New women of the South maintained their reproductive role while also keeping traditional markers of femininity, while also becoming a force to be reckoned with in public life. Mrs. J.O. Stevenson certainly would have been considered one of these new women, and it is significant that she would have been one of these individuals filmed and memorialized, and then also this film was exported other places. In March of 1914, Miss J.O. Stevenson also receives the honor of being elected state chairman by the Florida Southern Conference Association. So all happening around the same time, there is a rise for our local leader to be participating in statewide conversations about women's suffrage. It is her rally, which is part of the campaign of the Southern states for state amendments, that resonates with the women and people of St. Augustine. The second film I want to consider was filmed in St. Augustine, according to Tom Graham. Thank you for your wonderful book, Silent Film in St. Augustine. Over 120 movies were filmed in St. Augustine in the early 1900s. So we're going to talk a little bit about Bedelia the Suffragette. And like St. Augustine in Motion, there are no surviving film stills or reels of this early silent film, but I have found a plot summary, which we will talk about. And also, this is from a theater up in Canada, and we can see right there, Bedelia and the Suffragette. This is the only thing on the internet, aside from the plot summary, that I was actually able to find. So here's the plot. Bedelia gets a position with a suffragette family and finds to her astonishment that the men of the family do housework while the mistresses go to the office and she earns daily bread. She soon has the man of the house and her sons at her mercy, and her daughters are just trying to come to their rescue. They in turn are treated to the hard law of the land. Bedelia, in a state of shock, decides maybe she should call, I'm paraphrasing, she should call the woman of the family and has her return. But when she does, such a riot ensues that Bedelia, horrified, doesn't even stop to shut the door on her way out. So, that's fun. I think this is important because, one, this was filmed in St. Augustine, so conversations about this film would have been probably circulating in town. And it also, again, is participating in a streak of anti-suffragette films in the 19-teens. This is not the only film of suffragists that folks in St. Augustine are going to encounter in the movie theaters, that new exciting form of entertainment. Happening alongside that first suffragist rally in St. Augustine on March 5th, 1914, was a film that debuted in our town on March 6th. And this was playing at the Plaza Theater, which was one of our other movie theaters. And you can see down here, Special Tomorrow, Votes for Men, a two-reel imp comedy, a picture with a big surprise. And again, I can't find this film, I can't find a still, I can't find a script, but I did find a plot summary in the Motion Picture News, which was a publication in which new releases, conversations about actors, questions about films were all kind of gathered together and sent nationally. So I am going to share this plot summary with you. In the year 1927, the entire social order is reversed. Mrs. Mayfair is a traction magnate and boss of the city. Her friend, Mrs. Millions, is the mayor and comes to the office of Mrs. Mayfair to enlist her support in the fight the mayor is making against those militant suffragettes, of whom Miss Mayfair is a leader. Maggie Millions, the daughter of the mayor, while calling at Mrs. Mayfair's office, falls in love with the beautiful, young, innocent stenographer and makes a date to meet him. In the meantime, Gwendolyn Jones, a young reporter and friend of Maggie's, calls Mrs. Mayfair at her home in the interests of the paper. While she's there, she falls victim to the charms of the unsophisticated scion Clarence of the House Mayfair. He returns her ardent glances as she leaves the room, but being caught by his father, he is sent to bed. Percy Pinhead, Mrs. Mayfair's stenographer, overhears Mrs. Mayfair's plot to stuff the ballot boxes at the next election and so deprive men the right to vote. He phones his terrible news to his sweetheart, Maggie Millions, who, with the aid of Gwendolyn Jones, the reporter, gets this incriminating evidence on a dictograph. The young women confront Mrs. Mayfair and Mrs. Millions, and with this evidence, they threaten to publish and go public unless they can marry the boys they love and restore mankind its vote. They succeed. Mr. Mayfair had supped, not wisely, but well, and he turns and tosses in his bed. Mrs. Mayfair, waking him up, arouses him. He stares wildly about, then coming to himself. But there, the big scream is at the finish, and we can only wonder what was going to happen. Embedded in this plot is an aversion first to militant suffragists, and that is a broader conversation that is happening nationally, again occurring at the same time as Alice Paul is breaking away from NAWSA because she's finding the tactics of that organization not to be terribly effective. And again, discussions of the dangers of militant suffragists would have been circulating around St. Augustine. The stakes in Votes for Men, it is apparent that women engaged in militant tactics to achieve suffrage pose an existential threat to society. As political leaders, Mrs. Mayfair has transformed into a tyrannical entity, the literal enemy of democracy. The social order is mirrored in the upending of the domestic sphere. Inverted gender roles abound in the Mayfair house, and they are corrupting, contagious, and dangerous for the rest of the town. And yet, the plot summary reveals confliction about women's roles. Gwendolyn Jones, the reporter, and Maggie Millions are embodiments of new women. These two women have expanded public roles and are certainly the protagonists of this silent film, but they're also tasked with retaining traditional markers of femininity, of pursuing the marriage plot. So I find these two figures, Maggie and Gwendolyn, really fascinating. It is through their actions, their desire to marry the men that they love, that Maggie and Gwendolyn find themselves upending the reversed social order, and through that upending, make sure that men still have the right to vote, because as we know, if women get the right to vote, they will disenfranchise the men. But don't worry, Maggie and Gwendolyn are fully committed family women, committed to the ideas of reproduction, and they can also maintain a life in the a life in the public sphere. So I think that these three films well represent the very real discourse about the appropriate ways for engaging with the question of women's suffrage. These three films produce images of the new women that were circulating around St. Augustine, which not only shape expectations and representations in these films, but also resonate for St. Augustinians themselves. Ultimately, the battle for Florida's adoption of the state amendment is going to fail 4 different times. First in 1913, then in 1915, then in 1917, and again for the last time in 1919. The St. Augustine Record reports on the suffragists' attempts to push for the state amendment, and one of the articles reports that the men looked very displeased during that session. But that didn't really stop them. They kept going. One of the principal opponents of women's suffrage was Congressman Frank Clark. He adamantly opposed women's enfranchisement by invoking the Bible and went on to say, quote, "No Christian could believe in equal rights for men and women. Women, of course, were supposed to serve in the house, serve the family, be subservient to men, and they shouldn't be sullied by the dirtiness of politics." And moreover, he argued that the women's suffrage movement at its base risked overthrowing the United States government because it was socialist and had a radical element, and it would also enfranchise fully other Black Americans, and that was an existential threat he just could not reconcile. After the 1919 failure for a state amendment, the 19th Amendment was adopted by Congress in June 1919. And the 19th Amendment reads, "The right of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by the state on the account of sex." This is a major, important victory. I have gathered some political cartoons after the adoption of Congress and during the journey for ratification. I'd like for us to look at these together. It is important to note that these were syndicated cartoons, so these cartoons would have been appearing across the country. And if you haven't already had the chance, I'm just going to make a plug, go down to the St. Augustine Historical Society. They have a wonderful exhibit on political cartoons from 100 or so years ago. So shameless plug for my colleagues, where you can see some of these up close and personal. So the first one I want to look at is this one. So we have a woman hopping from the House to the Senate. She has an umbrella. She has a lot of forward motion and movement. And the little bear over here has this word of encouragement. Don't slip, sister. I really like that. The next one, the 36 states to ratification, is going to be depicted as a steeplechase. And this woman is riding, and you can see that this is going to be an intense race. But again, we have that little bear over there that says, "Come on, sister, I've got a bet on you." Again, this feels like a pretty triumphant and exciting political cartoon. I also just love that the woman is filled with agency. She's really capable. If you've ever rode a horse before, you know it's really hard to keep navigating them forward. So I really love this one. And then we have this one, Kissing the Bride, where the 19th Amendment is embodied right here by a young virginal woman, a bride. And Congress is the man that is giving her away. And we have a parade of old men that are all positioned as the groom. So, ultimately, the 19th Amendment is ratified by Tennessee. It becomes the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And it is important to note that Florida does not ratify the 19th Amendment. In fact, it's the only state in the Union not to take action on the 19th Amendment or the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. We'll get back to that at the end of the talk, though. So now I'd like to turn our attention back to the ways that the women of St. Augustine operated as new women, embodying those traditional female roles, engaging in racialized discourses of power, while also pushing forward and expanding influence into local public life after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. One of the ways that new women of the South expanded beyond the domestic sphere that was expected of them in decades prior was through the emergence of women's clubs and other organizations. As historian Elna Green explains, although increasing numbers of Southern women were working for pay in the early 20th century, the majority of Southern women remained unpaid workers. For them, volunteer associations filled much of their time, particularly for women of the urban middle class. Their activities in women's clubs, civic clubs, and church missionary societies were critical to the formation of the middle class and also critical for producing reform sentiment and having more impact than higher education or waged work. It is in these women's club organizations that women are starting to form different committees to educate themselves on public topics. They are organizing, they are influencing different aspects of public life. It becomes a really important space because it allows women for the first time to fully participate, well, not all the way yet, but to participate more thoroughly in a wider public presence. So I have a newspaper clipping here The women's clubs in St. Augustine, again, fall victim to some of the same problems of a lot of this research. There is not a lot saved about the early years of the women's club. Rosters, meeting notes. I tried contacting some of the state organizations with no luck. So we can only rely on reports here. One clipping that I'd like to just talk about occurs on Friday, October 1st, 1909. Members of the Women's Club who will work with registration canvases of the city next week, and women who are not members but are willing to help in this work, also members of the Business and Professional Women's Forum, are all being encouraged to help canvass, help register women to vote. One of the important suffragist leaders in registering white women to vote was Sister Esther Carlotta Burris. She was born in Richmond in 1898. Carlotta was involved in a lot of different things in St. Augustine. She ran a home for orphan girls while serving in the state leadership for the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She was the vice president of education for the Women's Club, canvassing and organizing speeches aimed at pushing white women to register to vote. And a problem that they kept encountering is women were really reticent to put their age down on their registration. So there ended up being kind of a compromise here where they could just write 21 plus and you didn't actually have to put your literal age down. There are going to be a number of articles in the record that, again, underscore some of the really intense racialized politics of the time. In the months leading to the election, the efforts of the women's clubs are reinforced by editorials published in the St. Augustine Record. I think this is on the next one. Yeah. In an article entitled "Speeches Made Last Night Were Eloquent," the Honorable W.A. McWilliams addresses a crowd of white women, impressing the importance of their role as newly enfranchised voters, claiming that, quote, "If we keep our beautiful Southland for the supremacy of the white race, then every white woman register now and cast her vote to November." He goes on to say that he does not want the African American women to be treated poorly, but he does want to reinforce the idea of the Anglo-Saxon white class as the group of people that should be governing. A number of other articles repeat the same plea to white women. Here you can see, have you registered? If not, why? Local conditions demand prompt action on the part of every white woman in St. Johns County. There is a lot of personal responsibility that is being placed into the paper. The responsibility is on you. We did the thing. We gave you the right to vote. Now it is up to you. In the name of the white citizenry of Florida, in the name of everything just and holy, get busy, register now, cast your ballot in November. Again, another article from the record. We can see that in St. Johns County, white women and black women are registering to vote. And here I just want to mention the first two women that registered to vote. Emma Grout was the first white woman to register, and Sarah Blocker, who was an educator at the Florida Normal and Industrial Institute, which ultimately becomes Florida Memorial College, was the first black woman to register to vote in the county. And she goes on to do other work, both at the college, but more broadly about empowering and enfranchising black women. And so, with the 1920 election, the women of St. Johns County begin their journey to enfranchisement. And I want to close this talk with a reflection of the afterlife of the 19th Amendment. It is often easy to think that as soon as a law is passed, that cultural change and political change happens instantly. The 19th Amendment passes on August 18th, 1920. In 1924, Indigenous women are finally classed as citizens, but also still face barriers to voting through the 1960s. By 1940, only 3% of eligible African Americans in the South are registered to vote. In the 1950s, laws are passed and others are repealed that allow Japanese and Chinese Americans to become citizens and gain the right to vote. And it's not until the Voting Act right of 1965 until the 15th Amendment was enforced. It isn't until 1969 that Florida, at the behest of the League of Women Voters, symbolically ratifies the 19th Amendment. It isn't until 1974, with the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity, that women can open bank accounts, apply for credit cards and mortgages without a male cosigner. Today, women still vote on policies and for politicians that reflect and impact their lived realities, their life chances, their bodies, their family structures. All of these conversations are ongoing. So I want to close this talk with a dedication to the women and their allies, past, present, and those yet to be, who continue to claim space for women to participate fully in America. Thank you very much. So now the fun and anxiety-producing part for me. Questions? Leslie.
Another date, December 13th, 1923, introduction of the Equal Rights Act, Making Peace, 19th Amendment. Another date, 1993, women legally stopped being chattel, the property of their husbands.
All really important dates. We could be here for a long time if we start listing everything out. But maybe we should be doing that. I don't know. Yes.
I'm glad that you mentioned club living. That was a very important part of women's suffrage. I always thought it was really interesting. They were upper class. They were women, usually very wealthy.
Yeah.
They're the ones that the Texas, a lot of us were. And in this town, wherever it was Christian temperance were big in the teens and the 20s. They were also, even though they may not be known as suffrage here, they were very active here. I'm sure there's a huge overlap.
Yes, and I think that ends up being true both regionally and nationally, that the temperance movement twines with the stakes for women, because part of the conversation early on in women's suffrage and part of the impetus to say that, hey, maybe we need to have some laws that can protect us is that extreme abuse of alcohol and kind of the violence that ensues after that. So I'm really, thank you for bringing that up, because that is an important connection. Here and then here.
One of the dangers of being able to bring your cell phone to a wonderful talk like this is that I didn't want you to think I was texting. I just wanted to know, it appears from what you said that Florida actually elected their first woman representative to Congress before women could vote. Is that true? That what Ruth Bryan Owen?
I'm actually not sure.
I think so. Look at, I just didn't want to be rude.
No, this is,
I believe
I,
so.
I tell this to my students all the time. This is the beauty of the 21st century, right? We can continue to go down rabbit holes and look things up and find information. So,
I'm a
yeah.
Walter Stillman Douglas scholar, so I know that she was friends with Ruth Bryan Owen, who was William Jennings Bryan's daughter, and Florida's first representative. And just from your dates, I'm pretty sure that Ruth Bryan Owen was serving us in Congress when women could not vote. And it's not, I believe that's true. Have your students look.
Yeah, we love to hear that, actually. I know that Jeanette Rankin also comes to Florida at the behest of the women's suffrage organizations to make an impassioned plea, please enfranchise the women in Florida, but ultimately fails in 1917. Because she also couldn't vote, but was participating as a politician.
If any of you are curious about the woman causing all the trouble up in Mandarin, Harriet Beecher Stowe was absolutely mute. They wanted her badly to be the other triumvirate with Miss Anthony and Mrs. Stanton, but she would not, because she had promised Frederick Douglass that she would not stand up for white women to have the vote until he could vote.
I feel like Shelby, I'll.
Very exciting.
Good. Excellent. I feel like there was a question in the back, then here, then here. Yeah. I watched that this weekend 3 times.
I always showed it to my students, and it's just incredible, and it's very fashionable, and I would recommend it.
I co-sign that statement.
Alice Paul and the Fight for Women is
Yeah.
it's
It's
excellent.
excellent. It's excellent. You get a real good look at the violence that was enacted against Alice Paul and the other women that are working with her, and their resilience anyway. You had a question.
Yes, along with these speeches that were given, was there any evidence or anything written about marches along with the speeches?
I didn't see a lot of evidence of marches, but I saw a lot of evidence of rallies and gatherings here in St. Augustine. Again, that might look different in other cities in Florida, but that's a good question. Shelby.
You mentioned Sarah Blocker.
Yes.
Her efforts here in St. Augustine. Was there any evidence to suggest that she was working with women from Jacksonville, such as Bertha M. White, and then also Daytona Beach with Mary McLeod Bethune, or did you not find, was that out of your scope?
So because this was only a 45-minute talk, I did not pursue those connections, but I made a note of them because ultimately I would like to continue to develop this into an article, kind of fleshing out other people that are circulating in and out of St. Augustine. I didn't get to mention her, but Helen Hunt West is also really important. She ends up being a reporter for the St. Augustine Record before going to Jacksonville. So there's so many cool stories of women around this, but I definitely want to continue to pursue and check that out. Yeah.
This is the 100th anniversary of MoCA in Jacksonville, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and it was founded by very, very pioneering women in the Women's Club of Jacksonville. So I'm wondering what happened to our Women's Club.
Yeah.
It was one of the first contemporary art museums in the country. It was extraordinary.
I feel like we need to take a trip. I think they have their archives in Lakeland, and maybe just start like poking around.
The Women's Club, you're saying?
The Florida Federation of Women's Club, and they have some other documents there.
What else did they do that we're still benefiting from?
I suspect a lot. Yes.
If we're interested in learning more, what resources do you suggest?
About this generally, about St. Augustine.
A little bit about the history, and then maybe, things on what we can do to make change now.
Ooh. I'm going to answer that both, but I'm going to answer the second one last, so I have time to think. Just like full transparency. There's a book by Elna Green called Southern Strategies, which really looks at the Southern suffragist movement that I found really enlightening and helpful. There are a number of articles that you can get on JSTOR, and if you can't get them on JSTOR, you can always reach out to me and I will send them to you. They might be available other places. I have them right in front of me, so that's the wrong one. There's the women's suffrage movement article, which I can't seem to get. The internet's being funny, I'm sorry. Kate Gordon and the women's suffrage movement, which was an article again by Kenneth Johnson. Kenneth Johnson writes a lot about Florida in particular and the suffrage movement, so he had a dissertation. So I would definitely look into anything that he has written because he clearly parsed out his dissertation to these really distinct movements of women's suffrage in the South, but in Florida in particular. And then there is another article that I thought was really helpful that had so many primary sources that I just wanted to track down. I think it's the women's suffrage movement, and the last name on that is Taylor.
And when you quoted David Nolan early on, is that?
So David Nolan's, there's an email at the St. Augustine Historical Society's archive. It's an email that we have archived there that kind of outlines other people in St. Augustine doing things.
And I just wondered if you were quoting from his book or.
No, I'm quoting from an email that we have.
Always best to have it straight from the.
Yeah, yeah. He wrote an email. It's in one of the folders. I'll defer to Nicole and Shelby on how to find that again.
What's the name of the first African-American woman from Florida Memorial?
Sarah Blocker.
Sarah Blocker?
Sarah Blocker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Call your blocker for your par.
Shelby.
So, once again, it may not be in your scope, but if you just happen to come across it in your research, do you think at this time as well, there was a big international movement of women's suffrage and women's rights in general? Do you think that I guess, uplifted the national movement here in the States, or do you think it hindered it? And I guess also maybe in regards to the Southeast.
I think I'm going to answer your question and get back to Nicole's second question. I think that anytime that there is solidarity and if that crosses borders and there is conversation generated by people that are being oppressed, I think that's always a good thing. Obviously, there's some differences in terms of tactics because those are going to be historically specific, location specific, but to bring this to the 21st century, I think that even now when things are not going the way that maybe you want, the most powerful thing you can do is being in a room and strategize how can we actually affect change. And sometimes that means being across state lines, sometimes that means you're going to be on Zoom, or sometimes that means you're lucky enough to be in the same room. That's how I want to answer that. Thank you guys so much.